Portland, Oregon, March 15, 2019. In the quiet suburbs of Portland, Oregon, a marriage that had endured for 40 years was reaching its breaking point. Melissa Carson, at 62 years old, sat alone in the living room of the home she had shared with her husband Timothy for nearly 4 decades. The house, a modest 2-story colonial on Maple Street, had witnessed countless moments of their life together. Yet it had never truly heard them speak to one another, not in any meaningful way. Timothy Carson, 65, spent most of his days at his accounting firm downtown, returning home well after dinner. His routine had become so predictable that Melissa could set her watch by the sound of his car pulling into the driveway at exactly 8:45 each evening. He would enter through the side door, place his briefcase by the stairs, and retreat to his home office without more than a brief acknowledgement of her presence. "So glad to have you here. Comment your city so I can bring cases from your region and also know where you're watching me from." Their daughter Hannah, 38, had grown increasingly concerned about her parents during her recent visits. She noticed how they moved around each other like strangers sharing a waiting room, polite but distant. When she asked her mother about it, Melissa would simply smile and change the subject, a deflection she had perfected over the years. The morning of March 15th marked their 40th wedding anniversary. Melissa woke early, as she always did, and prepared breakfast. She set the table for 2, placed a small card beside Timothy's plate, and waited. He came downstairs at 7:30, poured himself coffee, and headed straight to his office to review files before work. The card remained unopened. The breakfast grew cold. This was the 3rd consecutive anniversary Timothy had forgotten, but something felt different this time. Melissa didn't feel the usual disappointment or resignation. Instead, she felt a clarity she hadn't experienced in years. After Timothy left for work, she picked up the phone and scheduled an appointment with Catherine Wright, a divorce attorney whose advertisement she had seen weeks earlier but hadn't had the courage to call. That afternoon, Melissa began gathering documents she would need: financial records, property deeds, insurance papers. She climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, a space they rarely entered, filled with boxes of memories they had both chosen to leave undisturbed. As she searched through old filing cabinets, her hand brushed against a wooden box she didn't recognize, tucked behind a stack of Christmas decorations. The box was simple, made of cedar, with a small brass latch. There was no lock, nothing to suggest it contained anything of significance. Yet something compelled Melissa to open it. Inside, she found what appeared to be letters, dozens of them, all in Timothy's distinctive handwriting. Each envelope was addressed to her, marked with dates spanning their entire marriage, but she had never received a single one. Her hands trembled as she pulled out the first letter, dated April 1980, just months after their wedding. The words on the page were unlike anything Timothy had ever said to her aloud. They spoke of love, fear, hope, and a vulnerability she had never known existed within him. Melissa sat on the dusty attic floor, surrounded by 40 years of unspoken feelings, and realized that the man she thought she knew had been a stranger all along. But what terrified her most was a single line in a letter from 15 years ago that suggested Timothy had once planned something that would have shattered their family forever. Portland, Oregon, April 2nd, 2019. The discovery in the attic consumed Melissa's thoughts for days. She had taken the cedar box down to her bedroom, hiding it in her closet where Timothy wouldn't accidentally find it. Each night after he retreated to his office, she would read through more of the letters, piecing together a portrait of a man she had lived with for 40 years, but never truly known. The letters revealed a pattern that both broke her heart and ignited her anger. Timothy had written to her during every significant moment of their marriage, moments when she had desperately needed to hear these words spoken aloud. When Hannah was born, he had written about his overwhelming joy and terror at becoming a father. When Melissa's mother passed away, he had written about wanting to comfort her, but not knowing how. When they had struggled financially in the early 90s, he had written about his shame at not being a better provider. But what disturbed Melissa most were the letters from 2004, a period she remembered as particularly difficult in their marriage. Timothy had been distant, more so than usual, working late every night and barely acknowledging her existence. She had assumed he was having an affair or had simply stopped caring. The letters told a different story entirely. In these pages, Timothy described a darkness that had been consuming him since childhood. He wrote about his father, a man who had punished any display of emotion with swift and brutal consequences. He described how, at age 12, he had come home from school to find his mother gone. No note, no explanation, simply vanished from their lives. His father had forbidden him from crying, from asking questions, from showing any reaction at all. Timothy had learned to survive by building walls around his feelings, by expressing nothing, by becoming invisible in his own emotional landscape. The letters revealed that he had carried this survival mechanism into his marriage, believing that silence was safety, that unexpressed feelings couldn't hurt anyone. He had convinced himself that loving Melissa quietly from a distance was better than risking the vulnerability of speaking his truth. Melissa discovered that Timothy had sought help once, in 1997, calling a therapist's office and scheduling an appointment. But he had canceled it the morning he was supposed to go, writing in a letter that he couldn't bring himself to speak about his feelings to a stranger when he couldn't even speak them to his own wife. The April 2nd evening brought an unexpected confrontation, though not the one Melissa had been preparing for. She had been reading letters in the living room, having grown bolder about examining them during hours when Timothy was home. She had found a receipt that had fallen from one of the envelopes, a receipt from Catherine Wright's law office, dated 3 weeks earlier. Her hands froze. The receipt was in her name, but it had somehow ended up in Timothy's box of letters. She realized with growing alarm that he must have found her appointment confirmation, the one she had printed and left in her desk drawer. Timothy knew she had consulted a divorce attorney. That realization was interrupted by the sound of Timothy's office door opening, something that rarely happened before 10 at night. His footsteps moved through the house with unusual purpose. Melissa quickly closed the letter she had been reading, but it was too late to hide the box. Timothy entered the living room and stopped abruptly when he saw the cedar box open on the coffee table, surrounded by scattered envelopes. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Timothy's face registered shock, then something that looked like relief, then fear. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Melissa waited, holding her breath, hoping that this might finally be the moment when 40 years of silence would break. Before either could find the words, Melissa's phone rang, shattering the tension. The caller ID showed Hannah's number. Melissa answered and immediately heard panic in her daughter's voice. There had been an accident. Hannah was being taken to Portland General Hospital. She was conscious, and the injuries didn't appear life-threatening, but she needed them to come right away. The letters were forgotten as Melissa and Timothy rushed to the car. During the drive to the hospital, neither spoke about what had just transpired in the living room. But something had shifted. Timothy's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, and Melissa noticed tears streaming silently down his face. She reached across the console and placed her hand over his, the first intentional touch they had shared in months. He didn't pull away. As they pulled into the hospital parking lot, Melissa glanced at Timothy's profile and wondered if their daughter's crisis might somehow become the catalyst that would finally force them to confront the truth they had both been avoiding. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the letters held more secrets, darker revelations that she hadn't yet uncovered, truths that might explain not just why their marriage had failed, but why it had survived at all. Portland General Hospital, May 3, 2019. The fluorescent lights of Portland General Hospital cast harsh shadows across the waiting area where Melissa and Timothy Carson sat side by side, closer than they had been in years. Hannah's accident, while not life-threatening, had resulted in a concussion and several broken ribs from the impact. The doctors had assured them she would make a full recovery, but hospital protocol required observation overnight. The emergency had forced Timothy and Melissa into a proximity they had carefully avoided for decades. As they waited for updates from the medical staff, the silence between them felt different than the comfortable distance they had maintained at home. This silence was heavy with unspoken questions, weighted by the discovery of the letters and the knowledge that both were aware of secrets the other had kept. Timothy had left work immediately upon receiving the call, something Melissa realized he had never done before, not even when she herself had been hospitalized years earlier for pneumonia. His presence at the hospital, his visible distress over Hannah's condition, revealed a capacity for immediate emotional response that Melissa had believed he didn't possess. As the hours passed and they remained in the waiting room, Timothy began to speak. The words came slowly at first, halting and uncertain, as if he were learning a new language. He told Melissa about his childhood in ways he never had before, filling in details that the letters had only hinted at. His father had been a factory supervisor, a man who believed that emotions were weaknesses to be beaten out of children. Any tears, any expressions of fear or sadness, any display of affection had been met with punishment. Timothy described the morning his mother disappeared. He had been 12 years old, preparing for school, when he noticed her bedroom was empty and her clothes were gone. His father had simply stated that she had left and forbidden Timothy from mentioning her name again. For weeks, Timothy had believed she would return, that she had just needed time away, but she never came back, and he never learned why she had abandoned him. The trauma had shaped every relationship Timothy formed afterward. He had learned that loving someone meant risking abandonment, that expressing feelings meant inviting pain. When he met Melissa in college, he had been drawn to her warmth and openness, qualities he lacked but desperately wanted to be near. Yet even as he fell in love with her, he had been terrified to show it, convinced that revealing his feelings would drive her away. Melissa listened, recognizing for the first time that Timothy's silence had never been indifference. It had been fear, a deeply rooted terror that vulnerability would lead to loss. But as Timothy continued speaking, Melissa realized she needed to share her own truth, the secret she had carried for nearly 40 years that had contributed to the wall between them. She told Timothy about the miscarriage she had suffered in 1982, just 14 months after Hannah's birth. She had been 3 months pregnant when she lost the baby, a loss that had devastated her. At the time, Timothy had been consumed with establishing his accounting practice, working 16-hour days to build a client base. When Melissa had told him about the miscarriage, he had simply nodded and returned to his work. She had interpreted his response as indifference, as evidence that he didn't care about the child they had lost or about her grief. For years, Melissa had harbored resentment over Timothy's perceived coldness during that painful time. She had withdrawn emotionally, convincing herself that if he didn't care enough to comfort her, she wouldn't give him the opportunity to hurt her again. She had built her own walls, matching his silence with her own, creating a marriage where two people lived parallel lives that never truly intersected. As they shared these revelations in the sterile hospital corridor, both began to understand how profoundly they had misunderstood each other. Timothy hadn't been indifferent to the miscarriage. He had been paralyzed by his own inadequacy, terrified that any attempt to comfort her would be rejected or wrong. Melissa hadn't been cold or distant. She had been protecting herself from what she perceived as his rejection. A nurse emerged to tell them they could see Hannah, who was awake and asking for them. As they stood to follow the nurse, Timothy reached for Melissa's hand, a gesture so unexpected that she nearly pulled away. But she didn't. They walked together down the corridor, their fingers intertwined, taking the first tentative steps toward bridging the distance that had defined their marriage. Hannah, despite her injuries, immediately noticed something different about her parents. She could see it in the way they stood close together, in the way her father's eyes were red from crying, in the way her mother looked at him with something other than resignation. Hannah began to speak about her own observations of their marriage, how their silence had affected her throughout her childhood and into her adult life. After Hannah drifted off to sleep, Timothy and Melissa returned to the waiting area. Timothy pulled out his phone and showed Melissa something he had been hiding for weeks. He had scheduled an appointment with Dr. Catherine Wright, not the divorce attorney, but a therapist who specialized in couples counseling and trauma. The appointment was set for the following week. But as relief began to wash over Melissa, Timothy's expression darkened. He told her there was something else she needed to know, something the letters had documented, but she hadn't yet discovered. In 2004, during the period when his darkness had been consuming him, Timothy had made plans to leave permanently, not just the marriage, but everything. And what had stopped him, what had pulled him back from that edge, was something Melissa had done without even knowing it. A small gesture that had saved his life and their marriage, though neither of them had understood its significance until now. Portland, Oregon, June 10th, 2019. The therapy sessions with Dr. Catherine Wright began on a Tuesday morning in early June. Her office, located in a renovated Victorian house in the Pearl District, felt more like a comfortable living room than a clinical space. Melissa and Timothy sat on opposite ends of a sofa, the physical distance between them a representation of the emotional chasm they were attempting to bridge. Dr. Wright had listened to their initial stories with careful attention, taking notes as they described 40 years of miscommunication and silence. After their first session, she had given them what seemed like an impossibly simple assignment. Timothy was to write one sentence each day expressing something he felt, and Melissa was to respond to that sentence verbally. One sentence, one response, every single day. The exercise appeared trivial on its surface, almost insulting in its simplicity given the complexity of their problems. But as the days progressed, both Melissa and Timothy discovered that this small change demanded more courage than either had anticipated. Timothy's first sentence, written on a note card and left on the kitchen counter, had been almost painfully basic. He wrote that he appreciated the way Melissa organized the house. Melissa's verbal response, delivered that evening, acknowledged his observation and added that she had always hoped he noticed these small efforts. By the second week of June, the sentences were growing longer and more vulnerable. Timothy wrote about feeling inadequate as a husband and father, about carrying shame for decades of emotional absence. Melissa responded by sharing her own feelings of invisibility, describing how she had interpreted his silence as a verdict on her worth as a partner and person. The therapy sessions revealed layers of misunderstanding that had calcified over the decades. Timothy had believed he was protecting Melissa from his darkness, from the emotional damage his father had inflicted and the trauma of his mother's abandonment. He thought that by staying silent, by not burdening her with his pain, he was being a good husband. Melissa had interpreted this silence as rejection, as evidence that Timothy didn't trust her enough to share his inner life. During their fourth session, Timothy finally revealed the full truth about 2004, the year that had haunted him ever since. He had been experiencing what he now understood was severe depression, though at the time he had no framework to identify it. The darkness he described in his letters had been overwhelming, convincing him that his family would be better off without him. He had made concrete plans to disappear, researching how to start over in another state, even going so far as to open a separate bank account and transfer funds. On the night of September 15, 2004, Timothy had written what he intended to be his final letter to Melissa. In it, he explained his decision to leave, not because he didn't love her, but because he believed his presence was causing more harm than good. He had packed a bag, placed it in his car, and planned to leave the following morning before anyone woke up. But something had happened that night, something so small that Melissa had no memory of it. Timothy had been lying awake, frozen by anxiety and the weight of his decision, when Melissa had reached across the bed in her sleep and taken his hand. It was a gesture she had done unconsciously, perhaps dreaming, perhaps responding to some subconscious awareness of his distress. But for Timothy, it had been a lifeline. That unconscious touch had broken through his conviction that he was unwanted and unnecessary. It had reminded him that connection existed, even if he had been too afraid to acknowledge it. He had unpacked his bag the next morning, torn up the letter, and continued living the only way he knew how, in silence but present. He had never told Melissa how close he had come to abandoning everything, how a gesture she didn't even remember had saved not just their marriage, but possibly his life. Melissa listened to this revelation with a mixture of horror and heartbreak. She had been asleep, unaware that her husband was in crisis, unaware that she had played any role in pulling him back from a decision that would have shattered their family. The knowledge that Timothy had suffered so profoundly while lying beside her that he had been unable to reach out for help crystallized everything that was broken in their relationship. Dr. Wright helped them understand that both had been trapped in patterns established long before they met. Timothy's childhood had taught him that expressing needs led to punishment or abandonment. Melissa's own upbringing, which she began to explore more deeply in therapy, had taught her that love must be earned through perfection, that any sign of struggle or imperfection would result in rejection. They had created a marriage where both were dying of emotional starvation, but were too afraid to ask to be fed. The daily sentence exercise continued, growing more honest and raw. Timothy wrote about the nights he had stood outside Hannah's bedroom when she was a child, wanting to go in and talk to her, but paralyzed by the fear that he wouldn't know what to say. Melissa responded by sharing her own memories of those years, how she had convinced herself that Timothy's distance meant he didn't care about their daughter, when in reality he had been frozen by love too intense to express. Hannah, who had recovered from her accident and had been invited to join several therapy sessions, shared her own perspective. She described growing up in a house where her parents seemed more like polite strangers than partners. She talked about how their emotional absence from each other had taught her to be afraid of intimacy in her own relationships, how she had recreated their patterns in her marriage until she and her husband had sought counseling years earlier. By late June, the sentences had evolved into actual conversations. They were still brief, still carefully structured, but they were happening. Timothy and Melissa began taking evening walks together, something Dr. Wright had suggested as a way to practice communication in a neutral setting. During these walks, they started to share memories, both good and painful, examining their history with new understanding. But there was still one more revelation waiting, one that Melissa discovered when she returned to the box of letters. Hidden at the very bottom, beneath all the dated envelopes, was a sealed letter with no date at all. The envelope was heavier than the others, and when Melissa opened it, she found not just a letter, but photographs, documents, and evidence of something Timothy had been hiding for their entire marriage. Something that would explain the final piece of why he had built such impenetrable walls around his heart. Portland, Oregon, July 8, 2019. The summer heat had settled over Portland when Melissa discovered the sealed envelope at the bottom of the cedar box. Unlike the other letters, this one bore no date, no inscription beyond her name written across the front in Timothy's careful handwriting. The weight of it felt different, substantial in a way that filled her with both curiosity and dread. Inside, she found a letter that began with an apology, but it was what accompanied the letter that made her hands tremble. There were photographs, old and faded, showing a young woman who looked remarkably similar to Hannah. Legal documents with names Melissa didn't recognize. A birth certificate dated 1976, 3 years before she and Timothy had married. The letter explained what Timothy had hidden for more than 4 decades. Before he met Melissa, when he was just 21 years old, Timothy had gotten his college girlfriend pregnant. Her name had been Rachel Morrison, and she had given birth to a daughter they named Emma. Timothy had wanted to marry Rachel, to build a family, but her parents had intervened forcefully. They came from a wealthy family and considered Timothy, the damaged son of a factory worker, completely unsuitable. Rachel's parents had sent her away to stay with relatives during the pregnancy. After Emma was born, they had pressured Rachel into giving the baby up for adoption, despite Timothy's protests. He had been young, financially unstable, and legally powerless to stop them. The adoption had been closed, meaning Timothy would have no information about where his daughter went or who raised her. The loss had devastated him in ways that compounded the trauma of his mother's abandonment. He had lost another person he loved, another woman who had disappeared from his life, taking his child with her. When he met Melissa 2 years later, he had been terrified to tell her about Emma, convinced that revealing this part of his past would drive her away before their relationship even began. As years passed and their marriage continued, the lie had grown larger and more impossible to confess. Timothy had convinced himself that the truth would destroy everything, that Melissa would see him as dishonest and untrustworthy, that she would question whether he had ever truly been present in their marriage or if part of him had always been searching for the daughter he lost. The documents in the envelope revealed that Timothy had never stopped looking for Emma. Throughout their marriage, he had periodically searched adoption registries, hired private investigators, and followed leads that inevitably went nowhere. The money he claimed to be saving for retirement had partially funded these searches. The late nights he claimed to be working had sometimes been spent combing through databases and making phone calls to agencies that couldn't or wouldn't help him. In 2003, just before his crisis in 2004, Timothy had finally found Emma. A private investigator had located her living in Seattle, married with 2 children of her own. The investigator had provided photographs taken from a distance, showing a woman who had Timothy's eyes and Hannah's smile. Emma had been raised by a loving family, had become a teacher, and appeared to have built a good life. Timothy had driven to Seattle multiple times, parking outside Emma's house, watching her interact with her children, seeing the life she had built without him. He had drafted dozens of letters introducing himself, explaining who he was, but had never sent a single one. The fear of disrupting her life, of being rejected again, of being told he had no right to intrude after all these years, had paralyzed him. This secret had fed his depression in 2004, the knowledge that he had a daughter who didn't know he existed, that he had built a family with Melissa while mourning the family he had lost. The guilt of keeping this from Melissa had compounded his conviction that he was a fundamentally dishonest person who didn't deserve the life he had. Melissa sat in stunned silence as she processed this information. Timothy had a daughter, Hannah had a half-sister, and this secret had been lurking beneath the surface of their entire marriage. She understood now why Timothy had been so paralyzed by fear, why he had built such impenetrable walls. He had been terrified that any crack in his defenses would release this truth and destroy everything. But Melissa also felt a deep anger rising alongside her understanding. While she could comprehend why Timothy had hidden this initially, she struggled to accept that he had maintained the lie for 40 years. Every year of their marriage, every moment of distance between them, had been built on this foundation of deception. She had spent decades believing his silence was about her inadequacy, when it had actually been about his shame and fear. The therapy session that followed this discovery was the most difficult they had experienced. Dr. Wright helped them navigate Melissa's feelings of betrayal and Timothy's overwhelming shame. Timothy explained that he had written the undated letter years ago, intending to give it to Melissa many times, but never finding the courage. He had kept it in the box as a kind of confession he hoped would someday be read, a coward's way of telling the truth without having to speak it aloud. Hannah was informed about Emma's existence, and her reaction mirrored her mother's complex mixture of understanding and hurt. She had grown up feeling that something was missing in her father, never knowing that his emotional absence was connected to a loss that predated her own existence. Learning about Emma recontextualized her entire childhood, explaining the sadness she had sometimes seen in Timothy's eyes when he looked at her. A sadness she had always assumed was disappointment, but now understood was grief. The question that dominated their sessions became whether Timothy should reach out to Emma. Dr. Wright helped them explore the ethical implications, the potential for causing harm or providing healing, the rights of Emma to know her biological father versus her right to a life undisturbed by the past. Timothy was paralyzed by the decision, terrified of both action and inaction. Melissa surprised everyone, including herself, by advocating for contact. She argued that Emma deserved to know the truth about her origins, that she might have questions or health concerns that only Timothy could answer, that the chance for connection was worth the risk of rejection. Her advocacy for reaching out to Emma became a way of demonstrating to Timothy that honesty, even painful honesty, was better than the silence that had poisoned their marriage. In August, Timothy drafted a letter to Emma, working on it during therapy sessions with input from both Melissa and Hannah. The letter explained who he was, outlined the circumstances of her birth and adoption, and offered to answer any questions she might have, while making clear that he had no expectations and would respect whatever boundaries she chose to establish. The letter was sent on August 15th, registered mail to ensure it reached her. Then came the waiting, days that stretched into weeks with no response. Timothy oscillated between relief that Emma might choose not to engage and devastation that she might reject him, just as he had always feared. Melissa found herself in the unfamiliar position of comforting Timothy through his anxiety, a role she had never been allowed to play in their marriage before. On September 3rd, exactly 40 years and 5 months after Timothy had first learned he would be a father, Emma's response arrived. The envelope sat on their kitchen table for an hour before Timothy found the courage to open it, with Melissa and Hannah standing beside him. What they discovered inside would determine not just whether Timothy could heal from his oldest wound, but whether their family could finally move forward together, transformed by truth instead of imprisoned by silence. Portland, Oregon, September 3, 2019 to January 18, 2020. The letter from Emma Morrison Chen sat on the kitchen table as Timothy's hands shook too violently to open it. Melissa finally took the envelope from him and carefully slid her finger under the seal. Inside were 3 pages written in neat handwriting, and as Melissa read the first lines aloud, Timothy closed his eyes and listened to words he had waited 43 years to hear. Emma's letter was not angry or accusatory. She explained that she had always known she was adopted and that her adoptive parents had been loving and supportive. She had wondered about her biological parents throughout her life, had registered with several adoption reunion databases, but had never received any matches. Learning that her birth father had been searching for her, that he had wanted to be part of her life, answered questions that had haunted her since childhood. The letter described Emma's life in careful detail. She was 43 years old, married to David Chen for 18 years, and had 2 children, Lucas, aged 15, and Sophia, aged 12. She worked as a special education teacher and lived in a suburb of Seattle. She wrote that she would like to meet Timothy, but wanted to proceed slowly, perhaps starting with phone calls before arranging a face-to-face meeting. What moved Timothy most was Emma's closing paragraph. She thanked him for respecting her life enough to wait until she was an adult to make contact, for giving her the choice of whether to pursue a relationship. She acknowledged that learning about him had disrupted her sense of her own story, but in a way that felt like finally seeing a complete picture, rather than having something taken away. The first phone call between Timothy and Emma happened on a Saturday afternoon in mid-September. Melissa and Hannah had left the house to give Timothy privacy, though he had asked them to stay nearby. The conversation lasted 2 hours, and when Melissa returned home, she found Timothy sitting in his office with tears streaming down his face. But for the first time in their marriage, they were tears of relief rather than pain. Over the following months, Timothy and Emma built a careful relationship. They spoke on the phone weekly, sharing stories about their lives, finding unexpected similarities in their personalities and interests. Emma sent photographs of her children, and Timothy shared pictures of Hannah and stories about being a grandfather to Hannah's 2 sons, children Emma now understood were her nephews. In October, they arranged a meeting in neutral territory, a park halfway between Portland and Seattle. Melissa, Hannah, and Emma's husband David had all been present, understanding that this moment needed witnesses and support. The meeting had been awkward at first, 43 years of absence creating a chasm that couldn't be bridged in an afternoon. But there had also been undeniable connection, a recognition that transcended their lack of shared history. Emma met Hannah, and the 2 sisters discovered an immediate rapport despite the strangeness of their situation. They looked remarkably similar, shared the same laugh, and finished each other's sentences in a way that suggested blood connections ran deeper than experience. Emma's children, Lucas and Sophia, gained an aunt and cousins they had never known existed, expanding their family tree in unexpected directions. But the reconstruction of Timothy's relationship with Emma was only part of the transformation happening in the Carson family. The therapy sessions with Dr. Wright continued, and the daily sentence exercise had evolved into genuine conversations. Timothy and Melissa established new rituals designed to maintain the communication they were learning. Every morning, they had coffee together before Timothy left for work, a time dedicated to checking in with each other about their emotional states and plans for the day. They instituted evening walks around their neighborhood, using the rhythm of walking to make difficult conversations easier. During these walks, they processed the events of the day, shared concerns, and practiced the vulnerability that had been absent from their marriage for so long. The walks became sacred time, a daily recommitment to choosing connection over comfortable distance. Melissa had initially struggled with forgiving Timothy for the decades of deception about Emma. Dr. Wright helped her understand that forgiveness was not a single decision but an ongoing practice, something she would need to choose repeatedly as they rebuilt trust. Timothy, for his part, had to learn that Melissa's forgiveness did not erase his responsibility for the pain he had caused, that being forgiven meant accepting grace while still acknowledging harm. Hannah observed her parents' transformation with a mixture of hope and grief. Hope, because she was seeing them become the couple they had never been, but grief because she mourned the childhood she might have had if they had learned these lessons decades earlier. Her own therapy sessions helped her process these complex feelings and recognize that her parents' failures had not been intentional cruelty, but rather the result of their own unhealed trauma. In December, Timothy made a decision that surprised everyone. He began writing a memoir, documenting his journey from the traumatized child who lost his mother, through the young man who lost his first daughter, to the husband who had nearly lost everything because he was too afraid to be vulnerable. The writing became therapeutic, a way of organizing the chaos of his emotional history into a coherent narrative. As Christmas approached, the Carson family gathered with an addition. Emma, David, Lucas, and Sophia joined them in Portland for the holiday. It was the first time in 43 years that Timothy's two daughters had been in the same room, the first time his biological family was complete. The gathering was not without awkwardness, but it was filled with a tentative joy that suggested healing was possible. On January 18, 2020, Timothy and Melissa stood before their family and closest friends in a small ceremony at the same church where they had married 40 years earlier. They had decided to renew their vows, but this time, the promises were different. Instead of the traditional wedding vows they had recited in 1979, they wrote their own, acknowledging the failures of their first 40 years and committing to a different kind of marriage for whatever time they had left. Timothy's vows spoke about learning to use his voice, about choosing courage over comfort, about being present instead of protected. Melissa's vows addressed her own growth, her choice to ask for what she needed instead of waiting to be noticed, her commitment to believing that Timothy's silence no longer meant rejection. Both acknowledged that they were not promising perfection, but rather promising to keep trying, to keep choosing vulnerability, even when it was terrifying. Emma stood beside Hannah as they both watched their father make promises he finally knew how to keep. The image of Timothy's two daughters side by side represented the transformation that had taken place. What had been hidden was now visible, what had been broken was being repaired, and what had seemed lost was found. The small change that Dr. Wright had prescribed, 1 sentence per day from Timothy and 1 verbal response from Melissa, had opened a door that 4 decades of silence had kept sealed. That simple exercise had revealed that transformation did not require grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but rather consistent, daily choices to show up authentically and speak truth even when it was difficult. In the months that followed the vow renewal, the Carson family continued their work of reconstruction. Timothy maintained his relationship with Emma, building memories to partially compensate for the ones they had lost. Melissa discovered interests and passions she had suppressed during the years she had felt invisible in her marriage. Hannah watched her parents model a kind of relationship she had never seen them have, learning lessons she could apply to her own marriage. The cedar box of letters remained in Melissa's closet, an artifact of their past that served as a reminder of how much had changed. Occasionally, Melissa would read through them, understanding now that every letter had been an attempt at connection that Timothy hadn't known how to deliver. The letters were no longer evidence of failure, but rather testimony to persistence, proof that even when Timothy couldn't speak his feelings, he had never stopped having them. Timothy's accounting firm noticed changes in him as well. He began leaving work at reasonable hours, prioritizing dinner with Melissa over late nights at the office. He became more comfortable expressing appreciation to his employees, modeling a kind of emotional openness that changed the culture of the workplace. The walls he had built to protect himself had also imprisoned him, and tearing them down had freed him to live more fully in every area of his life. By the time spring arrived in Portland, bringing new growth to the trees lining Maple Street, the Carson home felt different. It was no longer a museum of silence and missed connections, but rather a living space where two people were learning daily how to be truly married. The transformation was not complete, perhaps would never be complete, but it was real and continuing. The story of Timothy and Melissa Carson demonstrated that it was never too late to begin again, that 40 years of distance could be bridged if both people were willing to take the first terrifying steps toward each other. Their marriage had been saved not by a grand romantic gesture or a sudden revelation, but by the accumulation of small daily choices to be honest, vulnerable, and present. The small change, 1 sentence per day, had been the catalyst that transformed everything. It had taught them that communication was not about perfect words or eloquent expressions, but about consistent efforts to be known and to know the other person. It had shown them that the greatest risk in relationship was not vulnerability, but rather the slow death of connection that came from playing it safe. As they approached their 41st anniversary, Timothy and Melissa understood that they had essentially started a new marriage, one built on truth rather than silence, on courage rather than fear. The first 40 years had been a cautionary tale about the cost of emotional avoidance. The years ahead would be a testament to the possibility of redemption, proof that even the most damaged relationships could be healed if both people were willing to do the difficult work of showing up as their authentic selves.